In this session, we're going to talk about the Gospel of Mark and some things about this Gospel that might be helpful as you are reading through it. Again, we have four different Gospels. Each of them have a particular and specific way that they are presenting the Jesus story. And as we go through this session, we're going to be talking about things that are particular to reading and helping us perhaps have some insight into this particular gospel. This gospel, Mark, was aimed for, in as much as we can possibly know, the Christian audience in Rome. The Roman Empire, of course, being at great expanse and extents in that day. And you could probably imagine those who are in Rome, a place, by the way, that Paul so very much wanted to do ministry in, and ultimately we know he got there. But can you imagine a gospel finding its way to Rome and telling the Jesus story in such a way that that story would connect with, or perhaps in just a few moments we'll see, would challenge the very establishment of the greatness of the Roman Empire and of the Caesar himself. So let's take a look and see how Mark tells this story. Just as an aside, it's very interesting that it is in the Gospel of Mark, in the very opening words, that we actually have the word gospel in the Greek, euangelion, from which we use to refer to the four Gospels. Mark simply writes the beginning of the good news, or could be translated the beginning of the gospel about Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God, as written in the prophet Isaiah. So right from the very beginning, Mark is establishing that this is a story of good news. This is gospel. Here are some of the characteristics that you will find in the Gospel of Mark. And when you start looking at these various characteristics, it becomes even more obvious that whether you consider them one at a time, or you take the whole group of these and consider them as a whole, or consider them together, that you can really begin to hear or envision that as the story of Jesus is being told in this gospel, you can almost hear it reverberating against the Roman Empire. You can just about feel it as it begins to find its way and penetrate and have voice in this world empire. So here are some of the things that you will see. One is the frequency of the use of the word immediately to refer to how Jesus does things, or how he moves along through the gospel. This is the shortest of the four gospels, and the author intentionally uses the word immediately throughout the gospel to move the story along fairly quickly. The word itself appears over 40 times. That is a lot, high frequency for a gospel that has 16 chapters in it. And one of the functions of the use of the word certainly moves the story along. It also sets it in the context of what might be anticipated in a Roman world, in which a superior or a general gives a command, or Caesar gives a command, the expectation is clear that whoever receives that command is to act upon it immediately. And so this becomes a bridge of conveying the Jesus story. And the idea as you're reading through this gospel is that Jesus does something and immediately he goes off and he does something else, and immediately he is doing this, and immediately he is over there. And so the story begins, or the gospel begins to share an echo of Roman military culture itself in depicting the way that Jesus moves along through his ministry by the use of the word immediately. And along with that, obviously, the expectation that when orders are given, that those who are to execute or carry out those orders do so with a sense of immediacy. Another feature of this gospel is that it is packed with action. This is the gospel that has a lot more activity, and usually it's high drama action that Jesus is involved in. And it's high on activity, it's low on long sayings of Jesus. For example, the Sermon on the Mount that we think of in terms of Matthew 5, 6, and 7, you don't get any length of that kind of words of Jesus in the Gospel of Mark. Obviously, there are sayings of Jesus. There are certainly times Jesus speaks, but they are, by comparison with any of the other Gospels, they are much shorter. Again, the reason is to communicate and to convey the Jesus story in the setting of a Roman military environment. And in Rome, as you could probably imagine, there's a high level of activity. Rome, the Roman Empire, is action-packed, and unlike, let's say, the Greek philosophers, in which there would be long discourse, long sayings, long speeches, Romans aren't necessarily not necessarily as essential to their culture. They want action. They want things done. They are a world empire, and they're managing that empire. They are extending that empire. Things happen immediately, and the story of Jesus is told in this gospel to connect with a culture that is used to drama, expects things to happen immediately when they come from their superiors, and is very used to high action content. Of the miracles that are told, that are relayed or conveyed in this gospel, it's very interesting to see that oftentimes they are, again, miracles that have something of a higher dramatic impact, and oftentimes laced throughout the Gospel of Mark. There are a higher degree of stories told of demon exorcisms, where Jesus confronts a demon, where he calls a demon or demons out of people. And this gospel is one that keeps bringing us back to the reality that in various places, in various ways along the journey and ministry of Jesus, he is encountering people who are demon possessed, and in every one of those cases, every one of those situations, he has authority and power over those demons, and he delivers people from demonic possession. He commands the demons recognize who he is, and there is again a very good connection here with the Roman Empire. Can you imagine a gospel again like this one, like Mark, finding its way into a Roman context and Roman environment? And here's the Son of God. Here's Jesus and the incredible power and authority that he has over things like demons, over things like the unseen world or the underworld. This, as you might imagine, would pose a highly potential threat to the Roman government itself, or the power that is based in Rome. When you present the Jesus story, not only is Rome out there guarding the map and expanding their territory, with something like Jesus on the horizon, or people who follow Jesus, imagine now opening a whole new window into a world in which Jesus and perhaps those who follow him have authority over the unseen world. You could probably see that this is a potential threat. This is a challenge to the Roman power that Jesus himself, if you picture it this way, is standing up against Caesar, or is being presented up against Caesar and Roman military might. And of all things, it is Jesus who, when he speaks, has authority in an unseen world, and he has power in that world. So you can see again how connecting all of this would be to put the Jesus story in those terms in a Roman world. One of the other features that certainly makes sense, along with all the things that we have mentioned, is that oftentimes throughout the Jesus stories and the things that he has done, it is clear that the crowd is amazed. Again, another theme that weaves its way throughout the gospel, that is, Jesus heals, as Jesus deals with people, as he casts out demons, that time and time again, the crowds or the people are amazed at what they can do. Again, you can see the connection with Rome. Perhaps you could envision something like Caesar, or a high-ranking military general, or a parade, a triumph parade after a great military defeat of somebody else. And perhaps you could picture people lining the streets as very important people are passing by, and a Caesar, or spoils of war, or an army. And you could certainly imagine how amazed people might be. And here we have people throughout the gospel who, when they see what Jesus is doing, are very much amazed at what happens. It is in this gospel as well that we have what is often called the Messianic secret. These are times in which Jesus does something. For example, he will cast out demons from somebody, and he will then tell them not to tell anybody who he is, who Jesus is. And that happens on a number of occasions. And this whole notion, or this whole idea, that the Gospel of Mark has something of a messianic secret in it, again, perhaps you can, in your own mind, begin drawing some relationship between the significance of something like a messianic secret and the telling of this story in the context of Rome. And this whole thing about don't go off telling everybody, don't go out proclaiming all of this stuff. There's something about that that certainly relates to Rome, relates to the Christian community, and certainly was something that Mark, or this Gospel of Mark, picked up on as this Gospel was written. And perhaps it was because that the whole idea of the kind of Messiah that Jesus was going to be would be twisted or would fall into the popular street understanding or expectations of what a Messiah would be if people just ran out and told what happened and said it was Jesus or the Messiah. And in just a moment we'll see that Jesus is going to use the term Messiah, and he's going to fill it with a connotation that might not have been the most widely popular or most widely expressed way of either envisioning or expressing who the Messiah would be. One of the other features in this gospel is the sheer number of times that Jesus does something or Jesus says something, and it seems to go right over the disciples' head or their understanding. It is clear that they don't get something. They haven't processed this, or they haven't heard it. They simply don't get what Jesus is saying. And in contrast to that, there are a number of places in which the people who do get what Jesus is saying are people that you would not expect to be able to do that. And in just a moment, we're going to take a look at a few illustrations of that. But as you are going through reading the story of Jesus, there's something of almost a fun side to this, in noting or recognizing how often the disciples hear or see Jesus do something, and they do not get, they do not understand, they simply do not grasp what has been done or what Jesus is saying. This kind of dovetails into the role that blind people play throughout the Gospel of Mark. We've already mentioned the number of times in which this Gospel relays stories of deliverance from demon possession. There are also a number of stories, or significantly placed stories, of people who were blind, whose eyes are opened, and the way that the stories reveal themselves, or the way that they are told and the placement of them in this gospel is oftentimes to counter the blindness of the disciples, who don't get things, and yet a blind person sitting on the side of a road gets things. He calls out to Jesus. There's something of this understanding or an insight that the blind have, and it is in contrast to the fact that people who are blind oftentimes get the Jesus story. They connect with the Jesus story, and people in this gospel, like the disciples, time and time again, are not able to see, not able to hear, not able to understand what Jesus is doing. So I'm going to just, to illustrate this, we'll just go to the heart of the Gospel of Mark, or I'll take from the midsection, from chapters 8 through 10, a way that we can just kind of get a brief glimpse into how all of this works. In chapters 8, 9, and 10, each of those chapters, Jesus clearly predicts his coming death. So there's no hiddenness to this. This is not some kind of secretive kind of thing. This is a clear proclamation, a clear pronouncement for his disciples, to his disciples, that he is going to die on a cross. What is interesting when you are reading through this section, through these chapters, is to look at the stories that surround these three distinct times in which Jesus predicts his coming death. And here's just a glimpse. It's not all of it, but it will be enough to put on your radar so that when you go through these particular three chapters, you can begin to identify clearly where Jesus makes the statements of his, or predicting a prediction of his death, and then you can begin to look at stories around that, perhaps through a fresh lens and with some good new insight for you. So, for example, in chapter 8, there's a blind man. There's a story about a blind man who sees, and after that story, there is the story of Peter's confession, in which Jesus has simply asked, "Who do people say that I am?" And Peter ultimately answered, "You are the Messiah." And here's one of those messianic secret moments. Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. Okay? So right after Peter's confession, or his acknowledgement that Jesus is the Messiah, Jesus goes on to predict his death. He then began to teach them about the Son of Man, how the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. So here we have leading into the story, or leading into Jesus saying that he is going to be crucified and raised on the third day. The story has the lead in of Peter's confession that you are the Christ, and turns right around and coming out of that confession and coming out of the prediction of Jesus, that Peter acknowledges who he is. Jesus has to say to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." And then Jesus goes on to talk about the cross again, and that those who wish to follow Jesus must take up their crosses and follow him. And so here you can see that as the chapter begins to unfold, a beautiful story about a blind man who is able to see, and it appears for a brief moment that Peter is able to see as well. He's able to see through all of the street talk that some say that Jesus is this, or he's John the Baptist, or Elijah, or something. Peter is able to see through all of that, and he knows that Jesus is the Messiah. Jesus then talks about his death and coming resurrection, and it is as if immediately after that, Peter is blinded by what just was said in the words of Jesus. And so chapter 8 is just a great place to see something of a way that a gospel writer will put stories not just randomly together, but actually will fashion stories, or take the stories and fashion them, place them in such a way that these moments where Jesus says something very dramatic, you can see how the stories leading up to that saying help us get a really nice understanding of some of the crowd response, of the disciples' response, and the stories or the sayings coming out of those very same sayings of Jesus help reveal how quickly an insight can fall into a sense of blindness or deafness. Chapter 9, we get something of the same thing. It is in chapter 9 in which the Gospel of Mark tells us the story about Jesus going up on the Mount of Transfiguration, and Moses and Elijah meet with him. Jesus has Peter, James, and John. They're apparently off to the side. They're missing a lot of what is happening, apparently tired and sleepy, but Jesus is engaging with Moses and Elijah, and there is this intense revelation of Jesus while they are there, and Jesus is not far away or far off from his upcoming death and resurrection. So this grand story of what happens on the Mount of Transfiguration, and then this story is followed by a boy with an evil spirit, and in that story we see that the disciples, a man has brought his son to the disciples, and they are not able to help him or cast out the demon. They bring the son to Jesus, and the son is foaming at the mouth, throwing himself down on the ground, rolling in the dirt, and Jesus casts out the demon. And so you see this incredible contrast of stories placed side by side, where there's this revelation, this glorious appearance of Jesus as the intensity of the kingdom of God is kind of displayed on the Mount of Transfiguration. And now you see real life on the streets with people who are dealing with something from the very gates and pits of hell itself, as this boy is demon possessed, and the disciples are helpless, and Jesus ultimately calls out the demon. Jesus then predicts for the second time his upcoming death and resurrection. And it is not too long after that that the disciples get into something of a little conversation with each other that's going to get going sideways, because they're going to talk about who is the greatest in the kingdom of God. And Jesus kind of catches up with that conversation, and he's either heard it or he senses or he knows that they've been talking about this thing, who's going to be the greatest, and Jesus has to set this whole thing straight. So here's a story in which Jesus, from the Mount of Transfiguration, this incredible experience with God, with Moses and Elijah, almost missed by the disciples. And you see again, the disciples almost did not get what all that was about. The disciples are not able to cast out the demons, or the demon from the demon-possessed boy. And Jesus has again told them about his upcoming death and resurrection. And it's not far down the road that the disciples are not trying to unpack the meaning, the significance of the death and resurrection of Jesus, of all things. They're talking about who among them is going to be greatest in the kingdom of God. And then in chapter 10, we'll see the same general pattern happen yet for a third time. Jesus will predict his death and his resurrection. But going into that story will be a story about small children who make their way to Jesus, and he places their hands on them, and the disciples kind of rebuke them. Perhaps children were, in the way. Perhaps they perceived that the kids were keeping Jesus from doing something important. And Jesus took the opportunity and took the moment to actually say, this is kind of what the kingdom of God is like. It's little children, and so he rebukes his disciples, and he even says to them, "Truly I tell you, anyone who will not receive the kingdom of God like a little child will never come in." And so as the disciples are trying to put the children, so to speak, in their place, Jesus says, no, the kingdom of God is just like this. It takes a childlike approach to get into the kingdom. And so that story unfolds, and then right after that, a rich man comes to Jesus and questions him, wants to know about the kingdom of God, and Jesus speaks to him and tells him that he must go and sell everything that he has so that he could come into the kingdom of God. And you compare that to what Jesus has just said to children, and in their culture, as you can imagine, and again, picture all of this being told in a context of a Roman world. You can picture that children are of little to no value in this particular story, so the disciples thought. The rich man would be a person, obviously, of great value, and perhaps his finances could help support the endeavors of the Roman Empire or army or whatever might be needed. And Jesus takes the children and says, this is the kingdom of God, and he tells the rich man to sell everything that he has. So you see this incredible contrast as Jesus is proclaiming and announcing what the kingdom of God is like. And then, of all things, after Jesus speaks to the rich man, he then predicts his upcoming crucifixion and resurrection. And of all things, listen to what happens coming right out of this. Then James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to him. "Teacher," they said, "we want you to do for us whatever we ask." "What do you want me to do for you?" Jesus asked. They replied, "Let one of us sit at your right hand and the other at your left hand in your glory." So here is this incredible moment where Jesus has used children. He has spoken to a rich man. He talks about his upcoming death and resurrection. And what James and John, these two brothers, get out of all of that apparently is, we want to have a little side conversation here with you. And we'd like for you to do what we're asking you to do. One of us would like to be on your right hand, and the other one of us would like to be on your left hand when you are in your glory. Talking about missing the moment, not seeing Jesus, not hearing what has happened. You can see again that there is a blindness that happens, that takes place in the minds and the hearts of, in this case, James and John. So that is enough to be able to demonstrate when you're reading through this gospel some things you're looking for, some things that you're looking to see how stories are placed together, why these particular stories were chosen, why these particular stories were told in such a way, and how they function in all of this. And oddly enough, after James and John made their request, there is the story of Jesus opening the eyes of blind Bartimaeus. So here are James and John in a state of blindness, so to speak, and here is Bartimaeus, a blind man who is made whole, who is able to see. So you can see how all of these, it's very interesting. Watch how all of this kind of current flows through the Gospel of Mark, and especially how this becomes heightened and becomes intensified in the very middle of the heart of the Gospel in chapters 8, 9, and 10. Just one last thing that I'll mention to you about this particular Gospel. This is a Gospel, just to remind you that the story of Jesus is going to be told with a Roman background or a potential Roman kind of audience. And this is the story that as the crucifixion of Jesus is told, and Jesus is already on the cross. He has been whipped, he has been beaten. Before that, he was tried. This is the story where in a very beautiful, moving kind of moment in which a number of people are watching all of this unfold. And Jesus breathes his very last. The curtain of the temple is torn from the top to the bottom. And then listen to these words. And when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus saw how he died, he said, "Surely this man was the Son of God." What an incredibly powerful moment. The story of Jesus, the gospel, the good news of Jesus is being told. For those with Roman culture flowing through their blood and Roman ideal and Roman hope and Roman sensibility, here is a centurion who has been standing there watching the whole thing unfold. And there's no telling what role this centurion may have played in the whole drama of the crucifixion of Jesus. Nevertheless, when Jesus has breathed his last, the centurion looks up and makes this confession that surely this was the Son of God. What an incredible word of testimony. Now put all of that into the Roman context that we have been talking about. And here is a Roman centurion who witnesses this particular part of the story of Jesus and who confesses as he watches this, as he bears witness to the resurrection, that this was indeed the Son of God. If the centurion who saw the event and who was there in the moment saw and acknowledged this was the Son of God, can you imagine the power of that story being told or being shared throughout the broader Roman world? A centurion made that comment. A centurion made that confession. And so you can conceivably see that this gospel is really slanted toward presenting the Jesus story, Jesus as the Messiah, the good news, in such a way that a Roman audience would be able to hear that story, would be able to see that story, and like the Roman centurion, would be able to come to the place of making the confession, surely this is the Son of God.